Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to a freezing cold afternoon here in London. We're bouncing around in November at 1 degree, but I'm delighted to have us beaming in from sunny New York is Anu Bradford, who's a professor of law and international organization at Columbia Law School. And today's topic is the Brussels effect, how the European Union rules the world. Now, I would point out that the emphasis here is on how. Anu is not maintaining that Europe is in some kind of super mode, but this is one of the most interesting books that I have read. And it appeared really almost out of the blue with respect to in February 2020, when a number of people picked up on this OUP publication. Essays occurred in the Wall Street Journal, reviews in The Economist and the Financial Times were glowing. And Andrew Moravcsik wrote in Foreign Affairs that the Brussels effect may well be the single most important book on Europe's global influence to appear in a decade. So we've got a lot ahead of us in the next 44 minutes. So I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien, and I think many of you out there in the audience know me, and I'm able to introduce so many of these webinars only because our sponsors, an eclectic and wonderful group of people, let us range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And I cannot congratulate them enough on their tolerance, allowing us to explore so many topics. Now, the agenda for today follows our normal format. I'm trying to get out of the way as quickly as possible. Anu will speak for about 20 minutes on the themes in the book, but also with a little bit of a look ahead at where she's headed. Not everything is in the past here. And we're then going to have a full 20 minutes for Q&A. I know that many of you out there have thoughts and opinions. Please place them in. And so the three housekeeping points. One, the slides will be posted, but Anu has no slides. So listen carefully to her arguments. Secondly, yes, this is being recorded, and the recording will go up within about 48 hours. So in other words, sometime late afternoon on Wednesday at worst, and you can share it with friends and family. And thirdly, how to participate in the Q&A. Please use the GoToWebinar facility. I'm here with you, so I'm not on email, I'm not on Teams or Signal or anything else. Just use the GoToWebinar Q&A facility. All of your comments, questions, observations with your email will be sent to Anu. So if there's any points of detail that you'd like to follow up or just to say hi and connect, you will get everything at the end of that. So Anu, without any more ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this kind introduction, and good afternoon to everyone in London and beyond. So the Brussels Effect book is my response to this very persistent narrative that portrays Europe as a weak, declining entity whose best days are over, and which has really little ability to influence the state of the world today. Because in my daily research and teaching, I encounter a very different kind of EU, an EU that is actually powerful, relevant, and I would argue very influential. So let me give a few examples of that European continuing power and influence. So if we start from here, the United States and digital economy, and we look at the companies like Facebook or Apple or Microsoft or Google, and look at the privacy policies that these companies have globally. They use the European Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, as their global privacy policy. Again, if we look at tech companies like Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, they are using the European standard of hate speech when they decide what kind of speech they take down from their platforms, as opposed to looking at a much more generous First Amendment of the American Constitution that would protect much of that speech that the European rules call them to take down. And it is not just the domain of digital economy or American companies that are affected in their global operations by European regulations. The EU regulations also influence how timber is harvested in Indonesia, what kind of pesticides farmers use in Africa, what kind of chemicals Japanese toy manufacturers use in producing those toys, or what kind of facilities are installed in Chinese dairy factories. So these are examples of what I call the Brussels effect. And the Brussels effect refers to the European Union's unilateral ability to regulate the global marketplace. The EU is one of the largest and most wealthy consumer markets around the world, and there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in the EU. So as the price for accessing the 450 million wealthy European consumers, these companies need to follow European rules and regulations. That's not surprising. But often these companies choose to follow the European rule across their global operations and their global business practices because they want to avoid the cost of tailoring their conduct and producing different products to different markets. You do not necessarily want to set up multiple production lines in order to produce to all the different export markets. And since the EU is often the most stringent regulator, so if you obey the most stringent European rules, you're normally good to go across the global marketplace. So that is basically the secret behind the Brussels effect, is that all the EU needs to do is regulate the single market. It can then sit back and wait for the global corporations and the market forces to then entrench those European rules across the globe. So one question is, why do we see the Brussels effect and not, for instance, the Washington effect or the Beijing effect? The EU is not the only large market around the world. And the fundamental assumption is that for any jurisdiction to be the unilateral global regulator, you do need to have a large market. So if you are Costa Rica and you decide to have very stringent environmental regulations, the companies conclude it's too costly, so they just abandon the Costa Rican market. But it's much harder to abandon a large market. But the US is a large market. China is a large market. But what I argue in the book, that large market alone is not enough. You also need to have the regulatory capacity so that you can unleash the power of that market and convert it into tangible regulatory influence. China does not yet today have the regulatory capacity that is vested, the expertise that resides in the bureaucratic machinery of Brussels. They can generate regulations and they can enforce those regulations. China is building that capacity, but it's going to take a while. The US, on the other hand, would have plenty of regulatory capacity. There's a lot of expertise and competence sitting in the Washington, D.C. What is missing, however, is the political will to deploy that regulatory capacity. There is no political consensus across the political parties in the United States to be pro-regulation. Instead, the US has chosen, since about 1990s, a path of deregulation. And by doing so, it has stepped away. The Europeans have stepped in and filled that vacuum, and in the process become the global regulator. And in making that argument, I also invite you to think about what power and influence means today, because regulatory power is often much easier to dispatch and deploy than, for instance, military power. That is very costly to use. So the EU is not a military power. It's not even the kind of financial power that the United States is. It doesn't have the reserves that Chinese have, but it has the regulatory power. And it is the kind of power that is very, as I mentioned, very cheap to deploy, because all the EU needs to do is to regulate its own market. It doesn't cost that much to generate regulations. It's the member state enforcement machinery that enforces those, and it's the corporations that pay the cost of compliance. It's also very difficult to undermine. So President Trump was able to walk away from the Paris Climate Accord. He was able to walk away from the World Health Organization. He was able to stymie the operation of the World Trade Organization dispute settlement, but he could not walk away from the Brussels effect. There's nothing a foreign government can do if its own corporations voluntarily choose to globally apply the European regulations. So let me now say a few words after I've explained why we see this phenomenon, on whether this is something that we should be celebrating or whether it is a cause for concern. And my main argument in the book is not to say that the Brussels effect is good for the world or it's bad for the world. I rather explain that whether you like it or not, it is a phenomenon that happens and influences us all. It influences the food we eat, the air we breathe, the products we produce and consume. Some people like it more than the others. So let me engage with a couple of arguments that have been laid out against this European unilateral regulatory power. So some people lament that regulation is costly. It deters innovation. We all know this argument very well. And if you take the Brussels effect seriously, it is possible that now those costs get multiplied across the global marketplace. And I think we should take this argument seriously. I remember when I was talking to one of the US tech firm's executives, and I asked him, what is the difference when you deal with American and European regulators? And he told me that, well, the Europeans want us to produce products that satisfy the consumer need. So the goal is to satisfy a consumer need. Americans want us to change the world or allow the world to be changed. And if every corporation produced products to satisfy the consumer need as opposed to trying to change the world, some of the most disruptive innovations that can be beneficial to the humanity would never exist. But at the same time, I think one would be too quick to conclude that every time regulation leads to greater costs and reduced innovations. There are many examples of very environmentally beneficial energy efficiency technologies that also have generated the kind of efficiencies that have made them economically very, very beneficial. We also see many examples, and this is from the argument of a great French economist, Thomas Philippon, who is here in New York at the NYU University, wrote a great book called The Great Reversal, How America Gave Up on Free Markets. And he shows how the lack of competition regulation in the United States has led to extremely concentrated markets, which has increased the profits for corporations, but also increased prices for consumers. That's why I pay so much less when I fly from Brussels to Madrid than when I fly from New York to Chicago. That's why my cell phone plan in Europe is a fraction of what it is in the United States, because those markets are very concentrated in the US, because there has not been a willingness to deploy antitrust laws to regulate them. So that's one argument that one hears, this idea that the regulation is costly. And my answer is yes, it can be, but it doesn't always have to be. Another argument that we often hear is that regulation is a reflection of European protectionism, especially in the tech space. Look at all these antitrust cases, competition cases that the Commission is bringing against US tech companies. There's been almost 10 billion in fines against Google. Yet another case has been opened against Google. There are cases open against Apple, Amazon, Facebook. It seems like Europeans would be targeting American companies. But if you really pause and think about it, there is no European search engine that they are trying to protect. There is no European competitor to Facebook. Who was the one that brought the complaint in the first place against Google? It was Microsoft. Often there are American companies on both sides of this dispute. So it's like an American company is fighting a civil war in the European territory because there hasn't been willingness in Washington, D.C. to provide them a remedy. So I think this idea of European regulation always being protectionist is also something that cannot really be proven by the history thus far. But let me mention here that tone of the conversation is shifting to some extent as we speak in Brussels. There's much more focus now that the UK is also out of the picture, and there's much more space for the Franco-German preferences to prevail. And some of those preferences are focusing very much Europe's strategic autonomy, digital sovereignty, technological sovereignty. There's a conversation of deploying competition law as an instrument for industrial policy. So the question is, will that actually be a criticism that will be valid going forward? Let me now also address a third criticism that I often hear leveled against the Brussels effect. So the cost, the protectionism, and the third criticism is the accusation of the Brussels effect being a manifestation of European regulatory imperialism. That this is the Europeans trying to impose their preferences for the rest of the world, and in the process compromising the ability of democratic governments elsewhere to provide the kind of regulatory choices that are consistent with the preferences of their own citizens. And we would be undermining then the political autonomy of individuals around the world in the process. And you cannot immediately reject that argument, because the truth is that the way European consumers and European citizens are trading off, for instance, privacy and other values are now being replicated around the world, even if all the foreign consumers would not think about privacy being as essential to them as it is to Europeans. But that criticism of regulatory imperialism is somewhat hard to sustain if you think about Europeans never asking these companies to apply the same standard elsewhere. All they are asking is to offer these standards when they operate in Europe, which they have the sovereign right, even the obligation to do. Europeans can regulate the European markets. If then Facebook chooses voluntarily to extend that standard to its users around the world, that is not Europeans exporting their standard as a way of imperialism. But it's also an argument that I think it's interesting to pause and reflect upon. So I'm eager to open the stage very soon, but let me, before I do that, address one more thing before we open it up, and that is the future of the Brussels effect. So if I have convinced you, and hopefully at least some of you, that today Europe is powerful and regulatory power matters today, will that power also continue into the future? And there are a few reasons to suggest that it might not. And one of them, let me maybe offer one external and internal reason with the time that we have. So one is the rise of China. Even if we don't see Beijing effect today, will it actually be the Beijing effect that we will be witnessing 10 years from now? And here I would say that for a moment, I would never question the rising influence of China. And the EU will be a smaller percentage of the global GDP every year, and China will be a more important part of the global GDP. So China's economic significance cannot be underestimated. But whether that immediately translates into regulatory power and the Beijing effect is another story. Because if you think about the determinants of the regulatory power, the GDP per capita is often a better predictor of the country's propensity to regulate. And it's going to be a long while before the Chinese GDP per capita catches up with that of the Europe, and there will be real willingness and pressure to regulate. That said, China is already deciding to take a few areas where it is charging ahead. One of them is digital economy, where it is really building an extensive regulatory framework. Sometimes, though, being so stringent that the foreign companies like Facebook, like Google, and like Microsoft make the decision not to stay on that market, but actually abandon the market of that size because they cannot reconcile it with their own fundamental values. So I would say that the Beijing effect may not be coming as fast as the focus on China's economic power alone might lead some of us to suggest or believe. So let me then mention an internal challenge to the Brussels effect. So we all know about the rising populism, anti-Europe sentiments in the EU, and I take those pressures and forces very seriously as a challenge to the EU. But the question of whether, for instance, the behavior of the anti-EU forces in countries like Poland and Hungary can bring down the EU's regulatory machinery is less likely. The EU doesn't need unanimity to generate regulations. And the zest of the anti-EU sentiment in these countries is not about regulation of the internal market. It's about the control of their borders, it's about judiciary, it's about the press, rather than thinking about the details of the regulation. I want to end with a few comments on Brexit, which could be seen as a big threat to the Brussels effect, because if we think about the foundation that you need to be a global regulator, is that you need to be a large market. Well, the EU just lost a big chunk of that large market. And I would argue it also lost very important regulatory capacity. The British bureaucrats were awfully good. And I think they did generate to the expertise that has allowed the EU to draft not just regulations, but good regulations. But at the same time, the UK was often the country that was more reluctant to go ahead with regulations. And now that constraint is gone. So I don't think that we immediately see any inability of the EU to generate regulation. If anything, We see the EU come up with the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, with the regulation for the AI, with the very ambitious Green Deal. There's no evidence that the regulation is slowing down in the EU. And if we think about the idea that the premise under the Brexit was that that would yield the UK a regulatory sovereignty. It could finally unleash itself from the regulatory shackles of Brussels and be independent. Well, the book argues that that is one of the biggest false promises of the Brexit campaign. There is no such thing as regulatory independence awaiting the UK on the other side of Brexit. The EU remains the most important export market for UK companies. It's almost 50% of the UK exports. And these companies need to continue to obey by the European rules. The EU is the #1 export market for critical industries like financial services, telecommunications, aerospace. If we think about also chemical regulation, for instance, these are all areas where the UK companies will need to be following the EU rules. And if you are a UK automobile manufacturer, do you want to follow the rules that allow you to export to the market that is 6 times that of your domestic market? No, you do need access to the export market. Do you then want to set up a second production line and produce different kind of cars for your domestic market? That is rarely in your economic interest. So what I have argued is that more than the Brexit undermining the Brussels effect, the Brussels effect directly undermines Brexit. What will change though, and this is very disconcerting for the promoters and advocates of Brexit, is that the UK companies might find themselves living in an ever more regulated Europe in the years to come, because the UK has chosen to become a rule taker as opposed to rule maker, and there is no longer the UK's voice that was sometimes quite skeptical of regulation around the table shaping those regulations. So in that sense, it's not just a false promise, but it's a different reality that the UK is affected by, but is less capable of participating and crafting and bringing into the reality. So let me, Michael, end it there, because I'm very eager to move to the questions, and we can talk about the present, the future, or anything that I failed to mention, and I look forward to your comments and questions. I cannot hear you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Anu. That was a really, really brilliant exposition, and thank you too for keeping the time. Folks, we do have some questions here, but please do get your questions and comments in early so I can feed them into the conversation. Now, Anu, just to open up, when The Economist reviewed, they gave as a good example the British plug, the British electrical plug, as something that used to be sort of prevalent but had faded away, and now, with the exception of a few odd bits of empire, everybody's moved into the 2-prong or sometimes 3-prong European system. That was a good example. Do you have a favorite example that you could give the audience just to give them something to get a grip on?
So I have many favorites, but the one that I would say just so far-reaching is the REACH regulation, the chemical regulation. Just because if you think about how chemicals are everywhere, so it's very hard if you look around in the room to even find an object that wouldn't have chemicals. It's the clothing, it's the plastics, it's most of the devices. They are affected by the chemical regulation. And it is the Dow Chemicals of the world that have decided that they do not include the chemicals that are banned from the European market into their products. So you know the famous Havaianas sandals in Brazil. They are prepared using the plastics that make them basically consistent with the European frameworks. And they use the same plastics in the sandals for all around the world. So chemicals is some of my favorites just because we could just name such a long list of industries that are affected by them. But I also really think about that if we think about farming, for instance, or if we think about GMOs, you could imagine a farmer that decides that here are my fields, this site, I don't use the kind of pesticides here, I don't use the GMOs so that I can export to Europe. And then I have another neighboring field where I say that this is the field that I use for harvesting, I can use pesticides, I can use GMOs. But you can't do anything to the bees, for instance, and the cross-pollination. that then causes some of those GMOs to find their way and basically commingle your crops. Or it may happen that when you are transporting them in the warehouse, and then you go to the European border, they inspect them and they find a trace of it, and basically you are banned from the European market. And that explains very concretely how there is the kind of technological inability for you to perfectly segregate the markets. And that is why many of the farmers, for instance, stay away from GMOs altogether, because they cannot take the risk of accidental commingling in some point of their crops, and the risk that comes from being banned from the lucrative European market.
Now we've got a couple of quite coy questions here. I want to pitch at you. Graham Elliott says, if the European bloc gains power through leading the regulatory process, what could stop its politicians issuing regulations solely for the purpose of increasing its own power and not for any inherent benefit to, say, the European consumer?
So I really think it's an interesting question in theory. If you believe that ultimately all the big powers are here interested in order to gain their own gain more influence. But if you look at the track record thus far, all the European regulations very much track the consumer preferences. So they're very much responsive to what kind of regulation Europeans want. So it seems like the theory for operation for Commission bureaucrats, yes, they care about their own influence maybe, but at the same time, they seem very attuned to what kind of regulations Europeans want. So if you think about these ideas, I talked about accusations of protectionism. For instance, the GMO example that I just mentioned was often portrayed as being just an attempt to keep American crops, for instance, out of the European market. But if you look at the Europeans don't like GMOs. It is very much a regulatory response to deeply held views among the European population. So it doesn't seem that we have examples where Europeans would be resorting to regulation as the means for expanding their power. A couple of other examples that I could use, so one I mentioned maybe here, is that we see examples of sometimes Europeans also endorsing standards that have been generated in America. For instance, on oil tankers that the US never managed to really export globally, but the Europeans thought that was a very good regulation and Europeans adopted them. And it was through the European regulatory power that actually became a global standard. So we have examples of Europeans also exporting either internationally agreed upon standards or even standards that have been generated in another country. So in that sense, I would say that the EU is also a contingent unilateralist. So the EU remains very keen in working with other countries on standard setting, as opposed to ruling the world alone, just maximizing its own power. So climate change, I think, is another good example of that the EU has been the leader in multilateral negotiations on climate change. But when those negotiations have been insufficient to address the concerns, the Europeans have also generated regulation on their own. But saying that we're willing to step back if there will be a multilateral solution that can then override our unilateral standard.
It's quite salutary for me that you raised, in fact, chemicals. In fact, there's an interesting strand here of environmentalism between the GMO, the chemicals, climate change, and of course, Europeans really adapting the precautionary principle as opposed to the American sort of, you can get away with anything that doesn't directly harm anybody. So it's a very, very interesting contrast there. Just following on from Graham's point, quick one, if you might, because there are a few here I'd like to get to, but just a quick one that follows from it by Clive Bullen. Does the EU make any money from setting regulations which are used by other countries? Or in what way is this power useful to Europe?
So it's a very good question. I wouldn't say that the EU makes money, but the EU doesn't lose money. So the main concrete economic benefit is that this Brussels effect levels the playing field, not just in the EU, but in the third markets as well. So European companies that are bound by European regulations don't take a hit in their competitiveness when they are selling products in Brazil or in America or in China. And if you have other companies that they are competing against in those markets are also bound by these same regulations and that follow those same regulatory standards. So the main economic argument for the Brussels effect that the EU institutions also use in justifying regulations is that you shouldn't be opposed to them, thinking that it's the European companies that bear the costs. If all the companies around the world are adjusting their behavior and playing by the European rules, we can guarantee a level playing field, not just home, but also abroad. So in that sense, it's not making money, but it's basically preventing losses and sort of allowing Europe to be true to its values, even export those values, without making only the European companies to pay for the cost of regulatory adjustment.
I once did a lecture and I tried to estimate the scale of people checking other people. And there are a number of numbers floating out there, but quite a few people believe in what you might call a modern OECD type economy. It could be a quarter of the workforce is actually checking what other people do, if you look at it in the widest sense. School inspectors, safety inspectors, health inspectors, loss adjusters, claims adjusters, there's a lot out there. And in fact, I looked at the US and they were very, very proud of things, but the minute you factored back in a lot of the litigation, you got to numbers again. So the estimates I came up with were 25%, pretty rock solid, and up to possibly 40%, depending on what you looked at in terms of checking. So there's an enormous amount here about what we do to check other people. Now, I noticed Michael Cooper has a really good point here, and it's your colleague Lina Khan, also at Columbia, I believe, does the appointment of Lina Khan change your perspective on regulatory will in the US, or is her task inherently limited by the lack of legislative cohesion in the courts more specifically? So I think very much Michael's addressing your point here. The third one, the political will to deploy regulatory capacity.
Yeah, so this is fascinating because it poses the question of whether this condition that has been missing, that has prevented the Washington effect from emerging, is actually on the verge of being changed. Because there is now a different public conversation in the United States about the regulation of technology, in particular about the deployment of antitrust laws. But here I would say that it is possible that it's changing, but there's very little to show for it to date. So we certainly see the Biden administration, and this hasn't been a Republican-Democrat issue. We didn't see extensive regulation under Obama administration. Bill Clinton was a huge proponent of internet freedoms and really exporting the freedom agenda. So it doesn't mean that when we have Trump out of the White House or Democratic control of the Congress, that we would suddenly see a spike of regulation, because there's been a very deeply entrenched American view that they don't trust the government quite that much. They do trust the markets more. And I wouldn't say that there has been a wholesale shift in that mentality in the United States. In some circles, and Lina Khan is among those voices that is bringing this alternative view to public fora. And then President Biden's appointments, including that of Lina Khan, shows that there is now an attempt by the government to push this new thinking that would involve stronger deployment of regulation and enforcement. But here are a couple of question marks. So one is that Lina Khan may be pro-enforcement, but Lina Khan needs to go to the court in order to do something. It's not like the European Commission that can ban a merger if it wants to ban the merger, and your best chance is to try to later on, years later, get an appeal overturning that in the European courts. Merger is hard to keep alive for all that time. Lina Khan would need to convince the American judiciary, and I am not sure, we haven't seen the signs yet that the US courts would be ready for an antitrust revolution. So that's what it would take. An alternative path is that we would see a Congress rewrite antitrust laws. And there are many bills pending. And there seems to be that the US Congress currently disagrees on everything except two things. One is both parties are against China, and both parties are against big tech. But the hesitation about big tech doesn't mean they're going to agree on how to rein in the big tech. So conservatives are much more worried about censoring conservative speech. The Democrats are much worried about hate speech that undermines, for instance, racial reconciliation in the country. So in that sense, I don't see yet the confidence that a dramatic overhaul of antitrust laws would emerge from this divided Congress at this time. But it's certainly a very valid question that occupies me a lot in trying to observe how far do we see a shift from rhetoric, which is all we see thus far, to actual legislative or administrative action that would be validated by legal interpretation of American courts as well.
Okay. Folks, we have a couple more, time for a few more questions or comments to slip in, but I'm going to move on to the next one. This is from Eric Veerman. Anu, do you think there will be more regulatory divergence between the UK and the EU on financial services? And if so, what would this mean for the future and the supervision of financial services?
So there needs to be some regulatory divergence because there's a political need to show that Brexit wasn't done in vain. The government needs to find something to say that the UK is not just tracking what the EU is doing, even if that wasn't in the economic interest of the UK. So I expect there to be, Brexit was a political, it was politically motivated. It was never done convincingly to advance the economic interest of the UK. There was a political agenda there, and that agenda remains a focus of the government. So I expect there to be some pockets of regulatory divergence, even if they come with the economic cost. And financial services is one of those areas where the UK probably feels that it has the opening to some extent go its own way, partially because that's where the UK is particularly strong, and the EU is relatively weaker. And there's some question of how much of that activity that the UK has managed to hold in London will actually find its way to Amsterdam, to Dublin, to Frankfurt, to other parts of the EU. And I think there we see data that goes a little bit both ways. Some of the early predictions haven't been materialized at that scale. At the same time, it also has given the Europeans the incentive to really rethink the European regulations so that Europe can be more competitive. So it's hard for me to make a long-term prediction of saying this is where I expect to be the real significant divergence, but I do expect there to be attempts for divergence, some of which will come with an economic cost. Some of them will probably become with a mitigated economic cost, and that's where the case for trying to pursue the UK's own path is the strongest.
Now, a lot of people tend to hear the word regulation and unlike you, not understand that in many ways the base regulation of all is competition policy. Particularly, if you go back to Adam Smith, who believed that's really what regulated things, and almost to a degree that all other forms of regulation were when you didn't really or weren't able to fully enforce that. Now, this is your thinking for your next book, as I understand, is looking at the regulation of the digital economy. Now, in the course of a lot of this, people also tend to think it's all about government. And, you know, for example, the shipping industry, until quite recently, was really regulated internationally. I couldn't go into your port and you couldn't go into mine if we didn't follow basic standards. And these evolved, in fact, before the nation state evolved. So we've seen some of that. We saw the rise of the internet, certainly in its early days, as being a very, very self-regulated area. Do you see that as something that, you know, could be a model ahead, or is that just sort of, you know, wishful thinking, as if I wish to bring back the Hanseatic League or something?
Yeah, so Michael, it's interesting, the American model for regulating technology, which I call the techno-libertarian model, has really relied on this multi-stakeholder governance, where the industry is in a key role in trying to find the beneficial standards where we can have common global standard setting that make our devices interoperable, but where the government steps back, and those who know the best, those who know the market, those who know the technology, are the ones that are competing within these standard setting organizations like ISO or ICANN with domain names to come up with the standards for the internet era that reflect the market actors' behavior. China has been the main challenger of this particular governance model. They have wanted state to take a much stronger role as opposed to private enterprises. And there the US and the EU have been both behind this standard setting model where the companies play an important role. So that one of the main indications that that model continues to prevail is that China has realized that it is not going to replace that governance with having the UK and the kind of state sovereignty replace it. So China has instead tried to gain influence in these standard setting organizations by nominating a lot of Chinese to leadership positions, to the extent that the US and the EU have kind of dropped the ball and haven't even realized how much the Chinese influence in these multi-stakeholder governance organizations have grown. Yeah. And the Chinese companies that participate in Chinese setting, standard setting, are much more closely linked to Chinese government than the European and American companies. So you're actually getting more of a government also within these organizations through the participation of Chinese companies. But if we take it a little bit more broadly, sort of what is the role of the state and the government and the companies in setting the standards for the internet, I generally see less and less faith in self-regulation or the companies being drivers of this new era, because the companies have failed us in many ways. We have so many privacy scandals. We have so many evidences of, you just replay the images of January 6th and the resurrection of the US Capitol, for instance, and you ask, do the companies really have control of how the speech online should be conducted and moderated? Or do we need to have a stronger role for government? So I think we are really in that pivotal moment when we are trying to find the right model to govern the internet. And I think the American conversation about the regulation of speech is a very illustrative. The Americans are very uncomfortable with the government telling what kind of speech should be online. But they are now increasingly disillusioned by the ideas that the companies should be left to the position to tell what kind of speech is good and what should go down. But they're also very uncomfortable with nobody doing it. Yeah. So it is very difficult to find the governance model that actually would be responsive to the fears of both overdoing it and underdoing it.
Yeah, it's interesting as well because people do, as you alluded to, they see regulation as anti-competitive. But I think it was Peter Swan about 20 years ago did a report for the DTI here, where he had what I call tree diagrams, and he pointed out that if you explore everything standards-wise, you're horrifically inefficient at innovation. But if somebody says, look, you're going to get this far in the standard, and then you branch out, you can make more rapid progress, which I think is an interesting point. We've got time for just two quick areas. A very interesting comment here from Eugenie Koch. With regards to the data economy, Anu, wouldn't you say that the Brussels effect mostly derives its power from its judiciary power instead of its regulatory one? For example, the Schrems 1 and 2 case illustrate how international data transfers are influenced by EU law. Or would you say that the regulatory power exists independently from the judiciary one? In other words, do you think the Brussels effect is purely regulatory?
No, absolutely. It's also confirmed and amplified and institutionalized by the decisions of the judiciary. And if you think about the famous or infamous right to be forgotten doctrine, that was invented in Luxembourg. That was first invented by the judges. You mentioned the Schrems decisions that brought down the data transfer agreement between the US and the EU. Is another example where the judges have been very pro-regulation, very much sort of being on the forefront of advancing the regulatory agenda. But then you saw, for instance, the right to be forgotten incorporated into the GDPR. So there is kind of they move in tandem, and sometimes there's also limits that the court set. So for instance, by saying that the right to be forgotten should not automatically be applied globally. That was also from Luxembourg. So there's a dialogue between the regulators, but in many areas, it is an example compared to the role of the courts in America, where the Commission has a lot of independent power. But it is true that the courts have partially created the kind of European Union where so much regulatory power has been validated as being legal because of the interpretation of the court in Luxembourg.
I shouldn't do this because we do tend to be strict on time, but in the green room, your thoughts on the future of carbon border adjustment mechanisms and the rise of ETSs in China. Any comments you could make in 60 seconds on how you see things playing out in the environmental sector?
So very quickly, there are certain elements of the Green Deal and the EU's agenda that are likely to have a global influence. One of them, I would say, is the ESG taxonomy. That's where the EU is at the forefront, and that can have a tremendous influence in investment flows and portfolios around the world. Another example is the carbon border tax. That is slightly different than the Brussels effect in the sense that there's more of a forceful, contentious enforcement mechanism. But it's an example where I think it may be a fight that is worth taking on for the EU because it would have a tremendous influence outside of the EU borders. As long as the EU does it in the way that is consistent with international commitments, so the implementation becomes absolutely the key. But I would say that if the EU has two priorities where we see most of the regulation coming, one is digital, the other one is environment, and in neither, I see nothing but the willingness to charge ahead with tremendous ambition and potentially also with the notable global influence.
Wow, what a great exposition. I've loved this enormously. If I can, three brief rounds of thanks. Firstly, to our FS Club sponsors. If this isn't right up our street, I don't know what it is, but thank you for letting us explore it. Secondly, to you, the audience out there, as ever, some very insightful questions today. The quantity doesn't matter as much as the quality, and we got the quality there. I'd like to thank you for listening, and as ever, please just check out the website for future things. But Anu, I think it's fascinating, your thesis and this whole bit about a large market, regulatory capacity, and the political will to deploy, those being the three big things. And I can see it'd be interesting to unwind what would make Europe not politically willing to deploy, for example, is one. What are the definitions of large markets? There's lots of things to tease apart here. But you've put out a great case in a very short period of time. Folks, I can only recommend the book because it's worth reading, and please go out and read it if you'd like to learn more. And Anu, perhaps we can have you back to talk about what you think we should be doing in regulating the digital economy when you feel you're ready to share those thoughts. Now, unfortunately, technology and digital regulation of me personally don't allow me to thank you properly by opening the floodgates of applause, but I have here my Korean karmic clapper, which is there to say a hearty and sincere thanks to you, Anu. We really appreciate your time and dialing in from New York, and I'm beginning to think Colombia is becoming a hotbed of regulatory thinking, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael. It was my pleasure, and many, many thanks for the insightful questions. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you.